I was a young youth minister working at my first job at a church. I'd made a pretty active program and we were attracting new families daily. One day, this single father and a little boy show up. The dad was a big guy and honestly, a little creepy looking. The little boy was a troublemaker, and on his first day there, he was already pushing other kids around and just being a bully. One day, I was sitting in my office alone, and I heard something in the copy room. I don't think anything of it because we kept our door locked and you have to have a key or be buzzed in to get inside. I assume someone with a key is in, maybe the other minister. After a few minutes, I heard a kid's voice, so I stepped outside into the lobby area. When I walked a few steps into the lobby, I found the creepy dad and his boy going through the cabinets. I had no idea how they got in there, so I stayed in the lobby with them. I say that I'm about to run some errands and I have to arm the office so they would have to leave. In reality, I was going to take a trip around the building to get rid of them. It is an ethics policy to not be alone with congregants in the building as protection for not only the congregants, but also the church staff. As we left, they went out one door and I went out the other. As soon as I got inside my car, the creepy dad started knocking on my car window. Reluctantly, I rolled down the window a little bit. He wanted to know if I could babysit his kid someday. He said he left the kid alone last week and the kid peed all over the apartment, so he was looking for a babysitter that would be a good influence on him. It was such a weird request, I said no, I couldn't do that. I had other obligations and had no room to fit that into my schedule. It was like something clicked in him after I said no. He had this nasty look on his face and tried to open my door for a few minutes. Then tried to push the barely open window down, begging me to babysit. I kept telling him no and I finally got the courage to just drive away. The next week, I heard them in the office again. I still have no idea how they were getting in or what they were looking for. This time, he came to tell me he recorded a special about Jesus, and he wanted to invite me over to talk about it and eat dinner. He said he would even buy wine. I told him no, that was not something I could do. He then invited the youth group to come over to his apartment and watch the movie. I suggested that we could watch the movie if it was at the church, but that's all. He got pretty agitated at this point. It was about this time I started getting weird text messages. I would get text messages that said, "You look so pretty today," and "I like that blue shirt," almost every single day. I started putting things together when one Sunday morning, I was using my cell phone in front of the church for a children's message when it started to ring. It was the number I had been getting text messages from. I had never responded to the number, so I just ignored it. When I looked up from my phone, I realized it was the creepy man who wouldn't leave me alone. He kept calling it and laughing in the back of the church. About a month later, the text messages were starting to get a little weirder. I was getting texts with graphic details of our date he had imagined in his head he was planning for us. I had mentioned the text to my male supervisor a few weeks before, and he suggested I respond that I was not interested. My professor at the seminary, on the other hand, said to completely ignore the messages, which I had already been doing. Ignoring the messages started to piss him off. The messages started getting a little aggressive, like, if you don't reply, you will regret it. Then one day, on my day off, I was in my living room, watching a movie, when I heard a knock at my front door. Outside of my family, the only other person that knows where I live is my supervisor. I went to the door and looked out of my peephole. It was the creepy man. "I know you're home. Please just unlock the door so we can talk about our date." I started freaking out because I couldn't figure out how he found out where I lived. Then I realized how. That was probably why he was going through the cabinets in the lobby. He must have found my employment file. After about 2 minutes of him trying to get me to open the door, I was able to muster up the words, "I'm on the phone with the police, they're on their way." This was when he took off running. The next day, I had a co-minister who was a male call the guy and tell him to stop, or I would press charges. The creepy dad then went and complained about me to the church board, saying I was leading him on and I was the one sending him graphic text. Whenever I did something in the service like pray or preach, the creepy dad would walk at and stare at me from a window outside until my part was done, and then would return to the sanctuary. We also found out that a congregation member, who was friends with the lady minister, put things together and said he wasn't just sending me messages, but to 5 other ladies in the church. He had been going around to various churches in the area, preying on the single women in the congregation, and using his kid as bait to get sympathy. He ended up having to move because of his job, but I'm still creeped out by him to this day. So at my church, there are usually a lot of people, mainly middle-class Americans, but there are homeless people there too. There was this old homeless guy who went there. He sat about 3 rows behind and to the left of me and my mom, and my dad at church. One day while we were in church, I was looking around the church to see if I could spot one of my friends. When I turned around towards the guy I mentioned before, I saw him just staring at my mom. Feeling a little uneasy about the situation, I kept scanning the room. When I turned back to the guy, I noticed he was staring at me. Now, with his eyes locked in on me, he gave me this nasty, creepy smile. I turned forward and didn't look back again. I was so freaked out. So the next Sunday, we go back to church and walk into the same row we sit every Sunday. On the pew, there's this piece of paper, and my mom picks it up and opens it to see what it is and if it has a name on it. She reads it to herself and gets so pale and drops the piece of paper down. I pick it up and read it, and it says, "Hello, Susanna, you probably don't remember me, but I remember you." She turned to the homeless man, who was just staring and smiling. How the fuck did this guy know her name? They never talked. Me and my mom leave right away and don't go back to church for 3 weeks and go to a different church instead. About a few weeks later, we start seeing this homeless man walking around our neighborhood. We live in a remote part of town, just with houses and some farms, no stores or anything, so it didn't make sense that this guy was out there. My mom started getting worried, and so she said it was best that I don't go outside without her, but I'm 8 at the time and don't listen. When my mom was in the kitchen, I decided to sneak out so I could ride my bike. When I got a few blocks down the road, I saw this man again, who went to our old church. At that moment, we both locked eyes, but I was terrified and started booking it back home. When I looked back, I noticed he was sprinting after me and yelling. He kept saying, "I want to speak with your mom. Let me talk to Susanna." I made it to the house, dropped my bike on the driveway, and sprinted inside. When I got inside, I told my mom I saw the same man from church right down the road, and he's coming this way. When my mom looked out the window, she saw the guy coming up our walkway, and she locked the door and called the cops. At this point, the man is banging on the door and aggressively trying to turn the doorknob. The cops come and he tries to get away through some woods, but they arrest him. It turned out he sexually assaulted 3 women from the old church that we went to. He got arrested, and I'm pretty sure he's still in jail now. When I turned 18, my mom told me she remembered him. It was a guy she was talking to long before she and my dad met, but broke it off because she got weird vibes from him after the second date. I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and me and my childhood friend Joe lived on a farm that bordered a pretty big forest. My parents would drop me off in the morning and we'd stay in the woods all weekend. We loved pretending we were frontiersmen. We'd build shelters and traps, practice making fire with sticks, the whole 9 yards. When we were in high school, we got this notion to pull a Stand By Me. This was based on the movie of the same name that had just come out. The idea was that we'd walk the railroad tracks out in the country, but instead of looking for a dead body, we'd find cool bridges to fish from and camp a little ways off the tracks. Of course, we knew this was dangerous and we'd likely be trespassing, but we were kids. We had a lot of fun. We did find beautiful rivers, we discovered bridges no one went to, we fished, and we hid from trains. At night, we camped in the woods just near the tracks and made small hidden fires. Nothing bad ever happened. After high school, me and Joe went our separate ways. We both left home, but always stayed in touch, and always tried to coordinate visits so we'd see each other occasionally. Well, one summer in the mid-90s, It worked out that we were both in town for about a week. We'd do stuff with family in the day, and at night, we'd either catch drinks at a bar or sit outside Joe's house around a fire and talk about the old days. One night, me and Joe got to talking about our trips. Soon we decided to take a day, walk the rails, camp one night, and walk home. The day came, and we started early morning. We had my wife drop us off in our old spot where we used to start, right outside of our hometown. She thought this was crazy and made sure to mention it. The day went fine. It was a little fun and a little sad, but in a good way. We found a bridge and sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We had no fishing gear, but we brought some canned food and other stuff. Before night started to set in, we picked a spot to camp. It was a thick forested area, trees on every side of the train tracks, so you felt like you were in a tunnel. We had both brought small hammocks to sleep on, but before we set them up, we decided to do a little scouting of the perimeter. We walked maybe 100 or so feet into the woods and up a small incline. We figured if we didn't see anything from on top of this short hill, we'd be fine. But when we got to the top, we saw an old building down at the bottom. About 100 yards into the woods, it was barely visible. We both assumed it was a sugar shack or something because there didn't appear to be a clear road into it. From where we were, there didn't look to be anyone in it either. All was quiet, no movement could be seen. We decided to walk a little closer just to make sure. We came down the hill very slowly, and as we neared the building, we saw it wasn't a sugar shack at all. It was an old church. It looked like it had been abandoned for years. It was a sagging building whose wooden planks were almost black from years of moss and rot. A cross still stood on top of the place, also weathered and black. None of the windows had glass, and there were no doors, just open doorways. We got close enough to see inside. There were rows of pews and a built-up section in front for a preacher to stand. We didn't go all the way in, we didn't want to. Beyond all that, there was no sign of anyone else. No footprints, no paths, no roads. It was just an abandoned church. We left immediately and went back up the hill to the spot we had picked to camp. Having a hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a little uneasy. We chalked it up to the natural creepiness of seeing a church in the middle of the woods. Besides, at this point, it was dusk, and we just decided to rig up our hammocks, go to sleep, and move on early in the morning. Night set in, and as we lay in our hammocks, we began to hear something in the direction of the church. Do you hear that? What the fuck is that? It sounds like people singing. We both slid right out of our hammocks and hunkered down, straining to hear more. We listened for a minute or two, and the singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. Finally, we decided to creep back up the hill and see if we could spy where the sound was coming from. The moon was barely out, but it provided enough light so you wouldn't walk right into a tree, but it was nearly pitch black. We didn't use flashlights as we crept slowly up the hill. When we got to the top, we saw light in the distance. It was coming from the church, and the singing was coming from inside. Joe and I put our heads close together and had a hushed conversation. The light looked to be candlelight from the way it flickered, and though we tried, we couldn't make out what was being sung. It sounded like church music, but in another language. We sat and watched for a while, trying to see who was in there, but we only occasionally saw shadows. We had no intention of getting closer either. We had about a football field length between us, and we aimed to keep it that way. The singing continued for a bit, and then it stopped. After that, a booming male voice began to chant. I was already freaked out, but this voice thoroughly scared the shit out of me. It sounded like some Old Testament preacher you see in movies, but again, it was like he was speaking in a different language because we couldn't understand a single word. Eventually, it got to where the single male voice would say something, and then a bunch of voices would answer in song. This lasted for a while, and then they all broke into this long, sustained wail that just kept getting louder. It got so loud and so disturbing that I covered my ears. Then it stopped. At this point, I was just getting ready to say, let's get the fuck out of here. when Joe put his hand on my shoulder and told me to be quiet. They were coming out. We were far enough away that we couldn't make them out well, but what we could see was a line of figures walking out of the open doorway, all holding hands in a single file. We could see some of them had flashlights. They began to sing again, and the light from the flashlights began to move toward us on the hill. We booked it back down to our campsite, grabbed our shit, and ran to the tracks. Once there, we ran down the tracks in the direction we had come from. After a few minutes, we stopped and looked back. We saw lights coming down the hill. They were moving erratically, like whoever was holding them was shaking them. We continued to run in spurts and walk as fast as we could. We eventually stopped seeing the lights and came to a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes away, and we walked there, got to a 24-hour gas station, and called my wife to come get us. My wife and other friends all thought it was just kids messing around, but I heard those voices, and they sure as hell didn't sound like kids to me. I'm not sure who those people were, but it was the creepiest thing that has ever happened to me. Joe and I agreed to never go to that spot again.